Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with your Alaska weather. As always, please visit our website at arh.noaa.gov. You can get any updates to our forecast. You can look at any watches, warnings, advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line 1-800-472-0391. Get updates to the forecast through that means as well. And we have a Facebook and a Twitter account that you can follow us on both of those. Taking a look now, we'll start off with our advisories that we have out for the state. In the Galena area there, we have a dense smoke advisory. That is going to be in effect until noon on Thursday, and that is for the lower Koyukuk and middle Yukon valleys. As we move off towards the east, we have a couple of wind advisories out there. Both are for gusty winds up to as high as 50 miles per hour, and both are in effect from 9 p.m. on Thursday until 6 p.m. on Friday. And those more specifically are near the passes west of the Tote Cutoff and any areas that are from Delta Junction and to the south. Look now at our fire danger throughout much of the interior, as would be expected with as much smoke as we are seeing out there. That extends from the upper Yukon Valley down throughout the central parts of the interior and to parts of the Kuskokwim Valley as well, and then out towards the Kotzebue Sound area. Then as we look down in the south central, there are a couple of little tiny areas there going from the Anchorage area up into the Matanuska Valley and then out in the Copper River Basin as well. Looking at our satellite imagery, we're going to start off in the west with our main area of low pressure that is sitting now south of the Aleutian Islands there, slowly tracking to the north and east, but bringing in a lot of lower clouds out over the Bering Sea as well, and northerly flow coming into the central and western Aleutian Islands that is bringing in some showers out to those areas. But then as we look out from that from that low pressure system, we can see the front moving in, starting to make its way into the Alaska Peninsula and towards the Kodiak Island area. Not quite there yet, even though the cloud shield is out ahead of that over the Kodiak Island area. As we watch this again, we can see weaker low pressure out over the Panhandle area, bringing in some lower cloud cover there and some isolated showers for the southeast. Then out over mainland part of the state, we have a band of cloud cover that is going down from the Arctic Village area down through the interior out towards the Norton Sound area. And as we watch this move, it's moving slowly off to the west, and we're seeing a lot of thunderstorms in that whole band of clouds there extending down towards the Norton Sound. So as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we'll stay up there for now, and we can see thunderstorm potential remaining through this afternoon and into the evening hours for the upper Yukon Valley, eastern parts of the Brooks Range, down through northern parts of the interior and out towards that Norton Sound area. For the rest of the northern part of the state, we do have some lower cloud cover out over the Arctic coastline, but not a lot of precipitation. And as we move down into eastern parts of the interior, some chances for isolated thunderstorms there as well. Not going to be as widespread as our area off to the west, but still a chance out there, especially in higher terrain. And then pushing down to the south in the Alaska Range and Talkeetna Mountains, chance of isolated thunderstorms out there. And then in the mountainous terrain in the southwestern part of the state, isolated thunderstorms are possible this afternoon there. As we get a little bit further to the south along the Gulf coastline, we are just going to see some showers, and we're going to see some even lighter showers as we get out over the southeast. Then as we get off to the west, we can see our main low south of the eastern Aleutian Islands and see that frontal system extending out into southern parts of the Gulf, bringing in a lot of warmer air from the south. It's bringing in a lot more rain, and some of that rain making its way to the Alaska Peninsula. And then with the northerly flow out over the Bering Sea, we are seeing some showers for the Pribilof Islands and the central and western Aleutians. As we move into tonight, we're going to have high pressure building in from the west, going to bring a lot of fog out to the Bering, Pribilof Islands, western Aleutians, and then in the central Aleutians going to start to mix with rain there with that fog. But our main low has now pushed over the Alaska Peninsula, with extending the front out now over Kodiak Island, out over the Gulf of Alaska. A lot of rain coming into the southwest. Kenai Peninsula now going to get hit with that rain. And in the evening time, before a lot of the precipitation from the front makes it there, there is still a chance for some isolated thunderstorms in the mountains in the southwest. So move up along the coastline, some fog and rain there going out over the Norton Sound area, but we are going to see in the evening hours thunderstorms present possible throughout much of the interior part of the state, especially in the evening. And then as we get into the Brooks Range, eastern parts of that too, and out towards the Ambler area. Then as this thunderstorm threat starts to diminish, we are going to have the possibility of a lot of fog forming as we get into the early morning hours throughout northern parts of the interior and along the Arctic coastline. Going to see some rain mixed in with that fog. And then down in the southeast, some rain and fog developing there overnight. So you have weaker high pressure there in the southern parts of the Panhandle. As we move into Thursday, that high pressure is starting to push down further to the south now, but we are going to see some lingering showers there. And as we look at our main front, pushing out very slowly, but now making its way just to the south of the Kenai Peninsula on Thursday, but bringing in that rain now throughout much of the south central with the exception of the Copper River Basin, but some showers out there for the Susitna Valley, but a lot of rain now for the YK Delta, Bristol Bay area, down into the Alaska Peninsula. And out ahead of that front, we trough and pushing into southern parts of the interior, bringing a potential for some isolated thunderstorms there, especially in the afternoon and evening hours. So again, to northern parts of the interior, going to see that potential for some isolated thunderstorms, but moving to the Brooks Range, that threat starts to diminish with just some fog on the other side along the Arctic coastline. As we move further to the west now, towards the Seward Peninsula area, going to see isolated showers all the way along the west coast, and then our ridging out over the Bering Sea, moving a little bit further to the east now, but bringing in a lot of fog underneath that with some lower stratus. And then we do have fog along the Aleutian Islands extending out into the central Aleutians. Moving into Friday now, we have our next system coming in way out to the west. Can't quite see any fronts on that yet, but that's going to start bringing in some southerly flow, some more rain expected for the western Aleutian Islands, and that westerly flow out with our weak ridging now over the Bering. Still enough to give us some fog there, especially out over the Pribilof Islands, expecting to see some rain and fog. But along the Aleutians further to the south, going to see just some more isolated showers, taking us into the Bristol Bay area. Out ahead of our weak ridging, we are going to see some fog and rain in the Bristol Bay area, especially along the coastline. That's going to extend up into the YK Delta as well. But as we move further to more inland locations, we are just going to see some showery precipitation extending out through much of the state until we get way out to the eastern parts of the interior and Alaska range, of potential for isolated thunderstorms there, extending up into the upper Yukon Valley, but not making it up as far as the eastern parts of the Brooks Range. Just going to see some rain along the Brooks Range and starting to diminish as we get along the Arctic coastline. Then for the remainder of the south central down into the Panhandle, going to see pretty widespread rain there, diminishing a little as we get to southern parts of the Panhandle. For our temperatures as of this afternoon, primarily in the mid-50s, getting up into the 60s for locations along the Gulf, and Skagway a little bit warmer there too, 60 degrees this afternoon. In the 50s for the most part in the south central, getting warmer as we get further to the north. Anchorage 65 degrees, Talkeetna 63, and 64 over there at Glen Allen, 55 for Kodiak. Going into the interior part of the state, primarily in the 60s. A little bit warmer there at Eagle, 72 this afternoon. A little bit colder there as we get closer to Arctic Village, 57 degrees. Then along the Arctic coastline in the 40s for the most part. Barrow a little bit colder, 39 degrees this afternoon. Down along the west coast of the state in the 50s in the Kotzebue Sound area. Tin City a little bit colder there, 47 degrees. Gamble at 45. And then down into the Norton Sound area, right around 60 degrees, some getting down into the 50s. Down in the Kuskokwim Delta, primarily in the 50s, warmer as we get more inland, 61 for Bethel, 64 for Antioch. In the 50s in the Bristol Bay area, King Salmon a little warmer, 60 degrees there. And then in the Alaska Peninsula in the 50s, but staying in the 40s for the most part in the Aleutians with the exception of Atka, 52 degrees this afternoon, and right around 50 for the Pribilof Islands. Lows for tonight staying pretty similar out for many of the Aleutians, staying in the mid-40s there, dropping out of 47 for St. Paul, and right around 50 degrees in the Alaska Peninsula, staying that way in Bristol Bay as well, and along the YK Delta. A little bit warmer there for Nome, 53 degrees for a low tonight. Staying pretty similar out by Gamble, only getting down to 43. And then in the Kotzebue Sound area, dropping down into the 50s, with Shishmaref staying a little bit warmer, 56 degrees for a low tonight. Along the Arctic coastline, dropping down into the 30s, with Kaktovik and Barrow both getting down to 36 degrees tonight. Dropping into the mid-50s in the interior, and colder as we get into the south central, dropping into the upper 40s there, with Glen Allen getting a little bit colder, 43 degrees, dropping down to 52 degrees for Kodiak, and then right around 50 degrees for most of the Panhandle. Tomorrow's highs, looking at temperatures getting into the lower 60s in the Panhandle, 66 there for Ketchikan, a little bit warmer there for tomorrow's high. Into the 50s and 60s for the south central, warmer as we get further to the north. Into the 70s as we get into the interior, with Fort Yukon getting up to as high as 74 degrees tomorrow. Then up into the 40s as we get into eastern parts of the North Slope, but getting up into the 60s as we get further to the west, with Point Lay getting up to 66 degrees. Shishmaref there, 72, as well as Kotzebue. And then down in the Norton Sound area into the 60s. Getting a little bit colder as we get further to the south and in the Bristol Bay area, only getting up to right around 60 degrees there. And as we get out into the western Aleutian Islands, only getting up to around 50 degrees out there. For our flying weather, we'll start off in the Bering Sea with all the fog and stratus that we're going to see out there. Widespread IFR conditions expected going down into the Aleutian Islands as well. As we push out into the Gulf of Alaska, Kodiak area going into the south central, as that front comes up, it's going to extend those IFR conditions further and further to the north, as well as those MVFR conditions should start a lot of these places VFR but drop down throughout the day. As we move up further to the north, we're going to see some MVFR, IFR conditions with a lot of that smoke that we're seeing out there. And then along the Arctic coastline with a lot of the lower stratus, we are going to see some IFR conditions for tomorrow. So Anaktuvik Pass will start off and remain VFR throughout most of the day, but there's the potential for some thunderstorms in the Brooks Range, and if the thunderstorms do happen, that will drop those conditions down to IFR pretty quick. Adigan Pass is going to be similar VFR, but the potential for some thunderstorms in the Brooks Range for tomorrow. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off marginal and drop all the way down to IFR as that front approaches. Similarly rainy, starting off in VFR, dropping down to IFR. Windy Pass will start off VFR and drop down to marginal conditions as we move into the afternoon, and Isabel will also start off VFR, drop down to marginal, as well as Mintasta Pass. Tanita will start off marginal, drop all the way down to IFR again as that front approaches. And similarly for Portage, MVFR dropping down to IFR in the afternoon. Chilkoot and White, however, will remain VFR throughout the day. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we have some warmer air coming up from the Gulf, no surprise with that warm front coming up. And then we have some colder air along the coastline squeezed in there before we get warmer with those warmer temperatures in the interior. As we move out to the west, we do have some cold air extending down out over the central and eastern Aleutian Islands before we get warmer as we push off to the west. For our icing for tomorrow, we have one area of icing that's going to start over the YK Delta area, extend eastward out through the south central, and then out over the eastern parts of the state, and that is all going to be above 12,000 feet. A little bit too warm as we get further to the south to have any icing below 15,000 there. So look at our jet for tomorrow. Strongest part of the jet, 125 knots, coming out of that southerly direction, moving out over Kodiak Island and kind of hugging the Gulf coastline before dropping down out of a northwesterly direction at 90 knots out over the Panhandle. No activity over the remainder of the state, but as we push off to the west, out over the western Aleutian Islands, a northerly component of the jet, 80 knots there, picking up to as high as 105 knots as it dips down into the North Pacific. Looking down at our 9,000 foot winds, we do have northwesterly flow of 20 to 25 knots out over the western Aleutian Islands. Then around our low pressure system out over the eastern Aleutian Islands, weakest flow on that southwest side, 25 knots there, get up to as high as 35 knots as we move out towards Bristol Bay and then back into the Bering, staying at that 35 knot range. Moving up further into the Bering, we do have that northeasterly flow continuing, only dropping down to around 30, but pretty quickly dropping down even lower and changing directions to be out of a southwesterly direction as we get closer to Russia, around 15 knots there. Out over the main part of the state, our southerly flow Right with that front, we're seeing stronger flow getting up to as high as 65 knots and only dropping down to around 55 knots, moving out over the south central, bringing in some stronger winds to that area. And then, but pretty quickly off to the east, going down to 25 knots, dropping down to 15 out over the northern places, and out over the Seward Peninsula around 25 knots there. Out over the Panhandle, flow out of a northwesterly direction around 25 knots, but picking up pretty quickly as we get into the Gulf there, up to as high as 50 knots. Down to 3,000 feet now, we'll stay out over the Panhandle, pretty weak flow, 15 knots out of a westerly direction, dropping down to really low out over the northern parts of the Panhandle, but picking back up to around 25 knots out of a northwesterly direction, moving out into Canada. Out over the state, most flow is out of a southerly direction, starting off pretty weak, 10 knots there, getting up to as high as 60 knots at 3,000 feet over Kodiak Island area, extending out through the Alaska range, but dropping down to around 30 knots as we get closer to St. Lawrence Island. Then around our low pressure system, southerly flow 25 knots there, becoming northerly as we get out over the Bering and going out to as low as 20 knots and as high as 35 knots as we get closer to the eastern Aleutians. Then for our turbulence, we'll look at our main area with those stronger winds that we were seeing going from Kodiak Island into the south central out towards Cordova, and then a little bit further east into lower parts of the Kuskokwim Valley. If you stay with us, we'll be back shortly with the marine forecast.
Good evening. I'm Harry Keeling, and on behalf of the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation and Alaska Public Media, welcome to Hangar Flying. This evening, our guest is Jeff Oshinsky. Jeff has had a distinguished career in federal service for 27 years, with 17 years in Alaska. In the early 90s, he was the manager at the ARTCC, later managed the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit and the Anchorage Volcano Advisory Center. He's now the Deputy Chief for Environmental and Scientific Services Division. In short, the Regional Weatherman. Jeff, welcome to Hangar Flying.
Oh, great. Thanks. It's great to be here, Harry.
Oh, welcome back. You've been on the program before.
Thanks, yes.
Obviously, weather forecasting is extremely important to pilots and operators and people involved in aviation. And you, the National Weather Service, has got a big operation up here in Alaska. I think latest numbers I saw were 240 people and 19 stations. It's a big effort. And I got to tell you, I appreciate what you guys do. You've got a tough challenge, and it makes doing the professional job that you do contributes significantly to aviation safety. So thanks very much. Let's talk a little bit about one initiative that you and I had talked about with future potential. So describe some of the modernization efforts.
Well, Harry, we're in the process now of modernizing our aviation services in Alaska. And what that means is basically going from an old way of doing business, of typing up forecasts and creating graphics by hand, essentially, to going to this digital database. And what this means, it will allow us to be able to derive a whole variety of products, basically whatever the users really want, from this digital database. And the beauty of that is all our offices in Alaska will be tied to this database. So whether you're a pilot or a mariner or whatever forecast you happen to look at, it's all being pulled from the same database and will be consistent.
So give me an idea, give our viewers an idea what a new product might look like. What exactly will it do that we can't have done now?
Well, I think the biggest change that we're going to see is we're going to see probably better resolution in the product. So in other words, we have the standard products like the MVFR, IFR flying charts and turbulence and icing. I think what we'll be able to see in the future is we'll be able to see more resolution and granularity in the forecasts. So we'll be able to forecast more distinct layers of icing and turbulence, and we'll also be able to put these products out on a more frequent basis.
Now, one of the things you mentioned to me, if I got it right, I think is very futuristic. And let's see if I can describe it right. So right now, if I'm coming back into Anchorage, I can get a terminal forecast for Anchorage, or I can get a terminal forecast for Elmendorf. But I think you're talking about maybe someday in the future, dirt strip XYZ with you can give me an idea what the weather's going to be there.
I think so. I think so. It's pretty exciting with this digital database. Part of the initiative is to improve our computer modeling. And of course, the computer modeling sort of drives how well we can produce forecasts. And as we get better and more specific models for Alaska that show the differences geographically, we'll be able to push that into this process. And so I think, this may be a few years out, but I think we'll be at a point sometime where a pilot can take his, we'll say his cursor of his mouse on his computer and move it to any location in the state and click on that spot that he's interested in, he or she is interested in, and get a forecast that'll have aviation weather parameters for that site.
Wow.
I really do think that we'll get there in a few years.
That's huge. I mean, when you add that to the introduction of weather cams, it's really going to make an impact.
It's going to open the doors. We keep saying that this is a major paradigm shift in aviation forecasts, and the really exciting part for us here in Alaska is we're on the cutting edge. We're sort of the pathfinder for these digital aviation services. Nobody else is doing this in the country, and all eyes are focused on us up here in Alaska.
I'm going to ask this last question about forecasting. Is it science, black magic, or luck, or all three?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I saw a cartoon repeatedly throughout my career that said meteorology is 60% science and 40% art. And I've seen the numbers flipped around, 60% art, 40% science. And so the big joke is that it's sort of a combination of all those things. When you talk to forecasters, they often talk about having a gut feeling. We're trained to understand patterns, and weather patterns dictate certain weather conditions. So, many of us can look at a weather map and look at a pattern and say, I don't think they're going to get the rain in Anchorage. I think it's going to be a turbulence event on the Chugach or whatever, just based on the weather pattern. And a small change in that pattern can totally change the weather for a given location.
Wow. Well, all kidding aside, I appreciate what you do and your fellow forecasters and the whole weather business, and I think you've saved a lot of people and prevented a lot of accidents. So thanks very much for your efforts.
Oh yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks for being on the program.
Thanks a lot, Harry.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. And again, I want to remind you, November 15th, we're going to have our fall safety seminar. That's Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation, November 15th. More details to follow. Until next time, fly safe.
Welcome back for the marine forecast. Starting off in the southeast part of the state. Wicker flow in the Gulf only around 10 knots out of a southerly direction, getting up to as high as 25 knots out of a southeasterly direction closer towards Yakutat, with seas getting up to as high as 11 feet. In the inside waters, 10 to 15 knots at variable directions there. Seas only 2 to 3 feet for Thursday. Then on Friday, southern part's going to stay pretty calm, but picking up a little bit as we get further to the north out of a southerly direction, 20 knots there. And then out over the Gulf, primarily southerly flow becoming more westerly as we get further to the south, 15 to 20 knots on Friday. For the south central part of the state, primary flow out of an easterly direction, a little bit more northeasterly in Cook Inlet, 20 to 25 knots there. Strongest as we get out further to the east in the northern parts of the Gulf, southeasterly direction, 40 knots there, 35 knots into Prince William Sound, and 35 knots as we get closer towards the Barren Islands as well. And then out by Kodiak Island, a southerly direction, becoming more easterly as we get closer towards Shelikof Strait. And west of the Barrens, we do have easterly flow, 35 knots there, with seas as high as 16 feet for Thursday. Then on Friday, flow switching up, becoming more southerly and southwesterly, 20 to 25 knots in all the inside waters there, and 25 knots out over the Gulf, only dropping down slightly in Prince William Sound out of a southerly direction, 20 knots there. Seas around 11 to 12 feet out in the Gulf. Then for Thursday, southerly flow on the Pacific side, 25 knots there with 10 feet for seas. Easterly flow in the Bering, getting up to as high as 25 knots in the Bristol Bay Area, dropping down to around 15 knots as we get closer towards Cold Bay. Then on Friday, flow becoming primarily southwesterly for all locations, 20 to 25 knots with the highest seas 10 to 12 feet on the Pacific side, 4 to 5 feet on the Bering side. For the Aleutian Islands, primarily a north or northwesterly flow, 20 to 25 knots in most locations. Seas getting up to as high as 9 feet on the southern side of the Dutch Harbor area. And then way out west, flow becoming more southwesterly, around 20 knots there, closer towards Shimia. Then as we move into Friday, all flow becoming more southwesterly, 15 to 25 knots, with the weaker flow as we get further off towards the east. As we move into the west coast, primarily a northerly direction, weaker up north by St. Lawrence Island, 10 knots there, getting up to as high as 25 knots towards the Pribilof Islands. And then south of Nunavik Island, we have easterly flow there, 25 knots. Then on Friday, flow becoming primarily more westerly, 15 to 20 knots, with the exception of up by St. Lawrence Island, out of a northerly direction, 15 knots there. Seas anywhere from 4 to 5 feet. Along the Arctic coastline, easterly flow around 20 knots all the way along the coastline, and then extending down as we get towards the west coast of the state, dropping down to around 10 knots out of a more northerly direction. Seas 2 to 4 feet. Then on Friday, similar trend, only around 10 knots out of a northerly direction along the west coast, and 20 to 25 knots along the Arctic coastline out of that easterly direction. Quick overview for tonight's weather. Going to see a lot of thunderstorm activity throughout the interior part of the state, extending down to the Alaska range and into the southwestern part of the state, primarily in the evening. And as those thunderstorms start to diminish, we're going to see some fog developing, and that rain is going to continue throughout the night with some fog and drizzle along the Arctic coastline. Fog and rain for the southeast part of the state diminishing as we get further to the south there. And we have our low pressure system coming up from the south, the main part of the low over the Alaska Peninsula, bringing in rain to the Bristol Bay area through Kodiak Island and starting to make its way into the Kenai Peninsula overnight. Out over the Bering Sea, high pressure building in, bringing a lot of fog to the area. Fog for the Atka and Adak areas, as well as for Shimia, with some rain there in the central Aleutian Islands. As we move then into Thursday, going to see that ridging pushing further into the Bering Sea, widespread fog there down through the central and western Aleutian Islands, with our main low now going north of the Alaska Peninsula, headed towards Bristol Bay, and seeing a lot of rain with that front now pushing into the Kenai Peninsula area. Rain extending now throughout much of the south central, with some showers out for the southeastern part of the state. We will still have some thunderstorm activity. That's going to be primarily in the interior, extending up to places along the Brooks Range, primarily in the afternoon and evening hours, but not as much along the west coast, where we're just expecting to see some isolated showers up there, and then some areas of fog along the Arctic coastline. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.